Golden light spilled across the polished marble of the annual press gala in New York, where applause erupted each time the name Julian Hayes echoed through the grand hall. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, he stepped onto the stage like he had done hundreds of times before, confident, magnetic, and with a presence that silenced entire rooms before he even spoke. Julian Hayes was a living legend, an investigative journalist who had brought down corrupt conglomerates, the founder of Hayes Report, one of the most respected independent publications in the country, a Pulitzer Prize winner, a voice of truth in a noisy world. But tonight, something was different. His voice trembled slightly as he began his speech. A sentence broke halfway through. One hand instinctively clutched at his chest. The audience held its breath. His eyes lost focus. And then, as if the reel of his life had snapped, he collapsed on stage. Amid gasps, flashing cameras, and a wave of panic rippling through the elegant crowd, the ambulance siren pierced the night within 4 minutes. EMTs rushed in. The man who had once wielded a pen like a weapon now lay motionless on a stretcher, surrounded by a sea of strangers, none close enough to hold his hand. Midtown General Hospital was where Julian regained consciousness. Harsh white lights, the sterile rhythm of machines, the sting of antiseptic in the air. A doctor entered, no hesitation, no comforting preamble. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, no treatment, no cure. 6 months, at best. Julian asked nothing, reacted not at all. He simply nodded and turned his face to the wall. The room was so quiet the heart monitor sounded like thunder. 6 months. 6 months for a man who had exposed society's darkest truths, yet never noticed the one growing silently inside himself. He had no family, no wife, no children. His parents had died long ago. His younger brother, a Boston lawyer, had cut ties after Julian publicly challenged a high-profile case. All he had left was a media empire and an empty house in Vermont. As the car pulled away from the hospital, Julian sat in stillness. The city blurred past like frames from an old, washed-out film. He had once lived to expose truth, to make the world listen. But now, no one waited for him at home. No one knew he had just been handed a death sentence. And worst of all, no one would remember once the final headline faded. The Vermont house looked exactly as Julian had left it. Quiet, orderly, almost disturbingly so. The tall windows faced a darkening pine forest. Autumn had slipped into early winter, and a silver mist clung to the stone path. No one waited on the porch. No voice called his name. He stepped inside, hung his coat on the hook, moving like a shadow, reenacting an old memory. The house was warm, the heating system still ticking on schedule. Everything was in its place, clean, undisturbed, untouched by time, except for the feeling. The feeling was colder than snow. From the hallway came a gentle female voice. "Welcome back, Mr. Hayes." It was Lena Brooks, the young woman who had managed his private archive for the past 3 years. Lena was quiet, discreet, meticulous. She was almost invisible in the house, always there, never intrusive. She read in the evenings, dusted old manuscripts, arranged documents by coded colors, and Julian had never really seen her. Until now. "You're still here?" "Yes, sir, I was notified of your return. I've been maintaining the system as requested." She didn't ask questions, no curiosity, no sighs, no pity. Just calm presence, measured and exact, like the silence itself was holding the house together. Julian nodded and walked past her into his study. Light poured through the tall windows. Everything in that room looked exactly as it had 3 months ago, but he was no longer the man from 3 months ago. On the desk sat his old typewriter, half-finished drafts, headlines that would never make print. He sat, opened his laptop, but didn't type a word. The screen blinked to life, revealing hundreds of unread emails, mostly from editors, reporters, publishers, not a single one from family. That evening, he ate alone. Lena didn't appear in the kitchen, but a tray had been set on the table, a neatly folded napkin, warm tea in a glass pot. Julian ate without tasting a thing. Night fell like an old blanket. Snow began to drift outside. Julian stood by the window, staring into the white slowly overtaking the woods. He had never feared the dark, but this time it wasn't the absence of light that scared him. It was the absence of meaning. At 11 o'clock, he left the study and walked down the hall. Lena was there, in soft golden light, arranging wildflowers in a ceramic vase. She looked up, surprised to see him. "Do you need something, Mr. Hayes?" Julian looked at her. This time, really looked, as if something essential had finally caught his eye. "How long have you worked here?" 3 years, sir. I'm from Boston. Before this, I worked at a public library and cared for my grandmother." He nodded, the kind of nod people give when they have no words to follow. He stood there a moment longer, then said softly, "I need to talk to you about me, about how much time I have left." Julian stood by the window a while longer, as if weighing whether to speak or remain silent. Finally, he turned to Lena, still holding the vase, calm, neither startled nor impatient. Maybe it was that calmness that made him brave enough to say it. "I'm not afraid of dying," Julian said, his voice low and steady like a well-edited article. "I'm afraid of disappearing, as if I never existed." Lena didn't answer, but she didn't look away. She placed the vase down near the window, listening with the kind of silence that held its own weight. "I used to believe I'd be remembered for my writing, for the truths I exposed. But the closer I get to the end, the more I realize that's not enough. Those things live on paper. I do not." He sat by the desk, fingers grazing an old folder. "I built a magazine. I fought for justice. But when no one says my name anymore, will any of it still matter?" "Still," Lena said nothing. But her eyes softened. She stepped a little closer, standing across from him in the muted light of the wall lamp. Julian looked up at her. "Do you believe a person can leave behind something truly alive after they're gone?" "You mean a legacy?" "No, not money, not fame. I mean a child." He paused, his breath shook slightly. "A piece of flesh. A quiet proof that I was here. A small soul who might keep walking when I no longer can." Lena was stunned. Not by what he said, but by how he said it. Without pleading, without pressure, without a plan. Just a man, quietly confessing a final wish. "I'm sorry if that makes you uncomfortable," Julian added, his voice barely a whisper. "I have no one, and I don't want to leave this world without leaving something alive." Silence stretched between them. Lena studied him for a long moment. In his eyes, there was no fire of former glory, only the quiet fatigue of someone who knew the clock was running out. I've never thought about having children," Lena murmured, "let alone bearing one for someone who's already leaving." "I know," Julian nodded, "and I'm not asking for a decision. I just want you to understand. I don't want to vanish like I was never here." She didn't reply, but as she stepped out of the room, her heart carried something heavy and sacred, a plea without a voice. Lena stayed in the archive all day. She rearranged the shelves, refiled old reports, wiped each drawer, as if the rhythm of movement alone could keep her thoughts from circling back to Julian's words. But every quiet space in that house echoed the same question. How could a dying man speak of life with such tenderness? As night fell and the walls grew heavier with shadows, Lena couldn't run from it anymore. She walked softly down the hall, stopping in front of his study. No knock, no hesitation. She simply opened the door. Julian was there, bathed in the same faded gold light, sitting before a desk where nothing new had been written. He looked up as she entered, not surprised, not hopeful, just a quiet gaze, as if he'd been waiting for her for a very long time. "I'll do it," Lena said, her voice barely louder than breath. "Not for money, not out of pity, but because maybe I understand what you're trying to leave behind." Julian rose slowly. "Are you sure? I don't know how I'll feel tomorrow, but I know I can't turn away from you. Not now." There was no ritual, no rush. They simply stood there, In the hush of the room, two people, one marked by time, the other carrying a fragile trust. Julian reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her brow. Lena didn't pull away. She inhaled sharply, trembling slightly, but her eyes never left his. When he kissed her, it wasn't desire. It was a whisper, as if he was praying, not for her body, but to remember what it meant to be human. In the dim room, Lena let her coat slip from her shoulders, her dress pooling soundlessly at her feet. She climbed into the bed beside him, not to love, but to give him the last thing she had to offer. They moved like a song nearing its final note, each moment held carefully, softly. When she trembled, he paused. When she gripped his hand, he held it gently and whispered, "I'm not here to take anything from you. I just want to remember what it feels like to live." When it ended, Lena lay against him, tears slipping silently into the fabric at his shoulder. Julian didn't speak. He placed one hand over her hair, still and warm, each heartbeat a quiet thank you. That night, they didn't make love. They exchanged existence. Julian weakened faster than any doctor had warned. Pain came in waves, stealing his breath and appetite. He could no longer sit up for long. Lena stayed close. She cooked small meals, read aloud beside his bed, cooled his fever with damp cloths. In the final days, they spoke less, often just holding hands in silence, but in that silence lived more than words ever could. Lena didn't ask if he was afraid, and Julian didn't need to say how grateful he was. Then, one night, just weeks after their night together, he collapsed in the hallway, right outside her door. She screamed for help, her hands cradling his head. The paramedics arrived in 8 minutes. Julian was rushed back to Midtown General, back to where it had all begun. From then on, his lucidity faded. When awake, he mostly whispered her name. Lena sat by him, holding his hand, telling him stories that trailed off without endings. Sometimes she sang, her voice small, trembling but warm. Sometimes she cried quietly, pressing her forehead to his hand as if in prayer. And then, one early morning before the sun could spill into the room, Julian slipped away. No final words, no movement, just the monitor stilling, softly, the way he had lived his final days. The funeral was private, no press, no eulogies. Lena stood at the very back, one hand resting instinctively on her stomach. The others, associates, lawyers, a few distant relatives, passed by her like she wasn't there. No one knew who she was. No one asked. She returned to the Vermont house after the funeral. Everything was the same, tidy, polished, and now emptier than ever. She sat on her bed, opened her small planner to jot down her tasks, and stopped. She was nearly 2 weeks late. A strange current ran through her, not fear, but a deeper instinct awakening. She grabbed her coat and keys, drove through the rain to the nearest pharmacy. When she returned, she carried a pregnancy test in her coat pocket. She sat in the bathroom, silent, counting seconds, and when the double pink lines appeared, undeniable, clear. Her breath caught in her chest. She placed a hand gently over her stomach. "You're here," she whispered. "You're really here." Tears came, not out of grief, but because Julian's final hope had become something real. News of Julian Hayes' death was made public soon after the funeral. Headlines paid solemn tribute. The man who exposed the truth has found his rest. There were memorials, statements from former colleagues and human rights organizations, but not a single word mentioned Lena. No one knew about that final night. No one knew about the offer or the quiet, steady yes she had whispered under soft light. She was pregnant, but no one believed her. No paperwork, no recordings, no photographs to prove a connection between her and Julian. Only a few work emails and payroll receipts listing her as an archive librarian. The estate manager from Hayes' report arrived at the Vermont home to catalog Julian's assets. They looked at her like an employee whose services were no longer needed. One of them said bluntly, "You should begin making other living arrangements. This house is company property." Lena said nothing, she just nodded. For the next few days, she lived like a shadow, ate little, slept less, and clung to the pregnancy test like a promise she'd made to someone who could no longer speak for her. Then, on a rainy afternoon, the doorbell rang. Firm, deliberate, insistent. Lena opened it. Standing there was a middle-aged man, salt and pepper hair, wearing a long trench coat. His eyes were sharp, intelligent, like they had already sized her up in a single glance. "I'm Thomas Ellery," he said, his voice low and clear. "I was Julian's friend and former legal partner." Lena didn't reply, but she didn't shut the door. Thomas continued, "I know about you. Julian told me. Not everything, but enough to know that if he were gone, you might need someone on your side." Lena stepped back slightly. She wasn't ready to trust, wasn't sure what she felt. "I didn't come out of pity," he said, eyes steady. "I came because Julian trusted you, and I trust him." After a pause, she let him in. They sat in Julian's old study. Thomas didn't ask about the pregnancy. No judgment, no suspicion, just one question. "Do you have any documents, any proof?" "Not yet," Lena whispered. "Only the truth." Thomas nodded. That's enough to begin. The courtroom wasn't as grand as Lena had imagined, but the air inside felt suffocating. The smell of old paper, the echo of shoes on marble floors, and the eyes on her, like she was an extra in a play she hadn't been invited to. Thomas sat beside her, dressed in a simple charcoal suit. He didn't say much, only nodded occasionally, a quiet, steady presence. Across from them sat two attorneys representing the board of Hayes' report, their faces sharp, voices cold as steel. They didn't see Lena as a person, just a problem to be erased. One of them stood and launched into clinical arguments, citing bylaws and legal precedents. No marriage certificate, no public acknowledgement of a relationship, no legal grounds to declare this unborn child as heir. Lena sat still, hands lightly clenched in her lap. The child inside her was still so small, but she could feel it, a fragile pulse matching her own heartbeat. When it was their turn, Thomas rose. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear and confident. Julian Hayes was a man of discretion, but not without foresight. He presented personal emails between Julian and Lena. Professional, yes, but unmistakably trusting. Then he played an audio clip from Julian's personal recorder. Julian's voice filled the room. "If I don't make it, and if Lena is carrying my child, please protect her. Let my child bear my name." The room fell silent. Next came the DNA results, ordered by Julian himself prior to his final hospitalization. The confirmation was indisputable. The board's lawyers began to falter, their tone losing its edge. And then came Thomas's final move, a personal testimony. He stood before the court, eyes steady on the judge. "I was Julian's closest friend. I knew him beyond conference rooms and court filings. I was there when he knew the end was near." His voice softened. He stopped believing that signatures on paper were enough to protect the one thing he truly wanted to leave behind: life. Then Lena was called to speak. She stood, each step quiet but firm. Her gaze never wavered. "I didn't come here to ask for anything for myself," she began, voice low but unwavering. "I have no title, no official acknowledgement, only a heart that heard his final request, and a life inside me carrying his last hope." Julian didn't see me as a servant. He saw me as someone who might carry a part of him forward. She paused, eyes glassy but unbroken. I said yes, not for love, but for trust. Because when he asked, it wasn't from power, it was from fear and from hope. I won't let that be erased by paperwork. The courtroom went still. The judge, a silver-haired woman with sharp eyes and a quiet depth, reviewed the documents again. Time stretched thin as thread. Then she looked up. Her voice was clear. "This court recognizes the child carried by Ms. Lena Brooks as the legal and biological heir of Julian Hayes, based on presented evidence, recorded intent, and verified consent." A gasp echoed from the board's table. Lena said nothing. She only closed her eyes. and for a fleeting moment she felt Julian, not in flesh, but in the justice that had finally been spoken aloud. The courtroom closed with a quiet victory, not just for Lena, but for a child whose existence had been questioned before he ever took his first breath. Yet, even as justice was named, her heart remained filled with spaces that no verdict could heal. And then, in the stillness that followed, life returned. Not loudly, but gently, in the form of a newborn's cry. The baby arrived on a quiet July morning, just before the sky could turn fully gold and the pine trees still breathed out mist. There was no loud cry, just a fragile, halting sound, as if life itself was testing the world for the very first time. Lena held the child against her chest, her hands trembling, but her eyes steady as stone. "Your name is Caleb," she whispered. "Caleb Julian Hayes." There was no one else in that moment, and she didn't need anyone, because the tiny boy in her arms carried everything that remained of a man she had once known through silence. When Thomas stepped in minutes later, he paused in the doorway, breath caught. He didn't ask questions. He didn't speak with sentiment. He just approached and looked at the baby like it was the most sacred thing he'd ever seen. "Meet my son," Lena said, smiling, with lips still weary. Thomas leaned down, touching one finger gently to the baby's open palm. "Hello, Caleb." From that moment, they never spoke of roles or titles. Thomas didn't call himself the father. Lena didn't ask him to be anything else. But he stayed. Every day. No promises, no expectations. He rose early to make tea while Lena caught a few more minutes of sleep. He changed diapers, read aloud to Caleb, cleaned the kitchen after every meal. Sometimes he simply sat beside Lena as she folded baby clothes in the late afternoon sun, saying nothing. His presence didn't press in. It floated around her. Soft, essential, like oxygen. And Lena, in the chaos of new motherhood, never once felt alone. Together, they began to build a life slow enough to breathe. Mornings were filled with the smell of toast and Caleb's giggles in his mother's arms. Afternoons were short walks through the trees behind the house, with Thomas pushing the stroller and Lena walking quietly beside him, their sleeves brushing now and then. Evenings were shared shifts, rocking Caleb to sleep, followed by quiet moments on the porch, where crickets sang and the day's final sigh settled between them. They never spoke of love, but it was everywhere, in the care, in the unnoticed gestures, and in the way Thomas's eyes always softened when Lena cradled the baby. She didn't know if this counted as starting over, but if it wasn't loud or dramatic. It was like a roof being rebuilt, from old, broken pieces, but this time made to last. That morning, a woman in a gray suit knocked gently on the wooden cottage tucked between Vermont's pines. Her voice was calm, her eyes steady. She introduced herself as a final representative of the Julian Hayes Memorial Foundation. "We discovered a document that had been misfiled," she said, laying a sealed envelope on the wooden table. "It's a handwritten note found in Julian's private safe." Lena opened it with trembling hands. On the thin sheet, she immediately recognized the handwriting, neat, quiet, unmistakably his. "If for any reason Lena Morgan cannot continue to care for the child, I request that Thomas Ellery assume full legal guardianship and full right to love that child as his own. I trust him, as I have trusted her." Lena didn't cry, but her chest tightened as if she'd just heard a promise that had never been spoken aloud. Julian had known. Long before she had, he'd seen something in Thomas, the steadiness, the silence, the kind of goodness that doesn't ask to be witnessed. That afternoon, Lena drove alone up the hill where Julian was buried. His grave was as unassuming as the man himself. No towering monument, no marble statue, just a flat stone with his name and the years etched quietly between the grass and the wind. She stood for a long time. Didn't weep. Didn't speak loudly. She placed her hand on the cool stone and whispered just enough for the breeze to carry. "Thank you for trusting me and for trusting Thomas." She bowed her head and her heart grew lighter than it had in years. For the first time, she no longer felt like someone chosen to survive, but someone allowed to truly live. That morning, the backyard glowed with soft golden light, and the scent of pine drifted through the cool air. There were no expensive flowers, no live music, no elaborate gown, just wooden chairs, simple ribbon garlands, and a handful of people who had stayed for love, not ceremony. Lena stepped out through the back door in a soft cream linen dress, holding Caleb fast asleep in her arms. Around her neck shimmered the old teardrop pendant Julian once gave her, catching sunlight gently, engraved inside with the words, "A future worth choosing." Thomas stood beneath the pines, no boutonniere, just a warm smile and grateful eyes. He opened his arms, and Lena walked toward him, placing Caleb into his embrace, then taking his hand like a vow unspoken. There were no long promises, only simple words exchanged. "We choose each other." Every day. The guests grew quiet, not out of awe, but reverence. No one forgot Julian, no one tried to replace him. But love continued, not as repetition, but as renewal. As dusk settled over the garden, Lena looked up at the sky, where the pines whispered softly in the breeze. Julian was still there, somewhere in the unnamed things, and she knew he was smiling. Spring afternoon. The sky glowed with honeyed light as the breeze danced through the willows lining the Connecticut River. Caleb toddled ahead, clutching his worn-out teddy bear. Lena and Thomas walked behind in quiet harmony. Lena's eyes followed her son. The shape of his eyes, the bridge of his nose were Julian's, but the way he laughed, turned back for his mother, nestled into Thomas's palm, those were new, not replacements, additions. She spoke softly, her voice blending into the wind. He didn't just leave behind a child, he left behind courage. Thomas gently squeezed her hand. "And you didn't just survive, Julian, you honored him, and you rose above." They paused at a wooden bench overlooking the water. Caleb clambered into Lena's lap, resting his head against Thomas's chest, humming a quiet lullaby. The sun dipped low beyond the trees, casting golden light over all three, like a final blessing from the past and a gentle welcome to what came next. Night had fallen deep. The house lay quiet, save for the ticking clock and the soft breaths of a sleeping child. Lena sat alone at the old wooden desk, lit only by a warm amber lamp. In her hands, a worn leather-bound journal, pages thick with time. She wrote slowly. There was no need to recount every detail. The memories lived on in her body, in her son's eyes, in the steady hand that held hers every morning. She remembered it all. The morning Julian collapsed on stage, the silent night they truly saw each other, the way Thomas looked at her in court, and the first cry of baby Caleb. Every ache wasn't erased, but held gently, part of a miracle she had never dared to dream. Lena closed the journal. On the final page, she wrote only one line, a quiet message for the man who was gone and the one sleeping peacefully in the next room. Love doesn't always arrive the way we expect, but when it stays and grows, it becomes forever. She exhaled, soft and steady, and blew out the lamp. In the darkness, a new chapter began. Not loud, not dazzling, just a gentle beginning. But this time, she knew she would not walk it alone.